Video games are great. The industry that makes them is not. And consumers have noticed this over the last decade with the debacle surrounding predatory microtransactions, misleading marketing, obtrusive DRM restrictions, and deliberate termination of features that players already paid for. And there is another, arguably worse side of the games industry that consumers don't get to see, because the suits that run the industry gag the few people that get to see it. This video will show you what they don't want you to see, and if you watch to the end, you will understand why they don't want you seeing this. This video analyzes the shady contracts pushed on developers, the people who actually make the game you play, by the publishers who are supposed to fund this development. Consumers do not usually get to see these contracts, as the publishers who draft them mandate developers to sign a non-disclosure agreement before they show the developers the actual terms of the contract. They don't want these terms to be public knowledge for a reason. Once the developers have signed the NDA, they cannot reveal whatever terms are presented to them, no matter how horrific the contract is. The developer is bound to silence under pain of ruinous litigation. With that said, a developer might get away without signing a non-disclosure agreement before the publishing contract is presented, and it is this rare occasion that gives us, the public, a glimpse of what goes on behind the scenes. Indeed, this is how the first document you're about to see was obtained. Subscribers may notice that the second channel already uploaded a video about it. So why make this second video about it? To explain the purpose of this video, here's a message from the channel's founder, operator, writer, and video producer, Overlord Gaming.
Overlord here with a brief history lesson. This video was made possible by a document I received in late 2022. It was a publishing agreement that clearly named its publisher in several clauses. While I was never legally obliged to keep any secrets, I deemed it wise to redact the publisher's name as I could not find a secondary source to confirm its authorship. The redactions rendered the video rather incomplete, and hence I felt it would be a better fit for the second channel. The redacted video received a response in the form of a comment from a developer named Squareglade who said, "I can confirm that the contract shown has similarities with the contract I signed with Critivo." Critivo is the name I had redacted out of the document I was given, which I will show to you uncensored so you can read along, or if you prefer, listen as I read it to you. The reason I no longer feel the need to censor the name is that Squareglade developed a game that Critivo is selling on Steam. So this confirmation is as good as it gets, and it's not the only one I got. My first video received another comment, though this developer was a bit more discreet and refrained from naming themselves or their publisher. Nevertheless, their testimony is crucial as they confirmed the clauses themselves. They are mostly industry standard. You would have a very hard time finding a publisher with more favorable clauses. The contract shown is very much standard. These developers were rather defensive about their publisher, but I would be too had I just publicly confirmed the contract you're about to see. I've also found 3 more contracts from 3 other publishers which will be analyzed later in this video. So if you watch the first video, you can think of this as an expanded, uncensored sequel. Let's begin by unveiling the contract that the first video had redacted. This is how the company named in the contract describes itself on its own website. Critivo is an international indie game publisher based in San Diego, California. We specialize in helping indie developers deliver their games to multiple platforms by giving teams the support and space they need to achieve their vision.
Does the contract allegedly presented to developers hold up to these principles? You be the judge.
Developers shall deliver to Critivo 1 copy of the fully functional Gold Master for the product in executable object code form for each platform in electronic format, bug-free.
Hold on. What game is bug-free before launch? Does any studio on Earth have the time or personnel to crawl through every inch of the game at every second of the game's timeline to ensure there were no bugs anywhere at any time? Even AAA developers with hundreds of millions of dollars ship games riddled with bugs, even after several delays to their release date. And here, this publisher expects independent developers to manage what the larger studios cannot. This is not conjecture. Critivo's website says it specializes in indie developers. What independent developer has the resources to ensure there won't be a single bug? Because that's what the contract demands. Or does the contract mean something else when it uses the word bug? How does the contract define bug?
Bug means any deviation from the commonly accepted standards for normal operation of games, or any material error, including, without limitation, an abnormal cessation of functioning of the product.
Doesn't sound very different from how the gaming community would define it, which does not make the contract sound very reasonable.
Developer represents and warrants to Critivo that the Gold Master for the product will operate in accordance with commonly accepted standards for operation of such product, will be free from any bug, significant programming errors or anomalies.
What happens if the publisher finds a bug or anomaly? Then it may not qualify as the Gold Master the contract requires of the developer.
In the event developer fails to deliver the Gold Master for the product by the Gold Master delivery date, unless such delivery date is extended by mutual written agreement of Critivo and developer shall be deemed to be in material breach of this agreement.
Unless such delivery date is extended by mutual written agreement. All the publisher has to do is not agree in writing, and they will have deemed the developer to be in material breach of the agreement. How likely is the publisher to agree to extend the date? Everything depends on the incentives. Does the incentive to extend the date outweigh the incentive to deem the developer in breach? If they agree to extend the date, the developer gets to ship the game. What incentive does the publisher have to disagree? What does the publisher gain from holding the developer in breach?
If Critivo terminates this agreement pursuant to this section, all amounts paid by Critivo in connection with the product shall be fully and immediately refundable.
If the publisher chooses not to agree to extend the delivery date, their contract gives them the right to terminate the agreement and demand a refund of all the money they pay to the developer. Well, wait, there's more.
In the event of termination by Critivo prior to the release of the product for a material breach by developer, Critivo shall have the right to obtain a refund of all unrecouped advances and other reimbursable sums paid by Critivo to developer hereunder.
Unrecouped advances. What's that? Searching the contracts for advance points to this clause.
Critivo shall have the right to request additional translations or localization of the product by providing notice to developer. Critivo shall choose the manner, method, and cost of each localization, subject to approval from developer, which approval shall not be unreasonably withheld. Such costs shall be deemed an advance hereunder.
Again, who gets to decide who's being unreasonable? The contract does not say. The publisher gets to choose to mandate additional translations, and the method, and the cost, as well as deem those costs in advance. A similar clause has already become a point of contention in an unrelated lawsuit between another publisher, Digerati, and a developer that signed with them, Radical. To be specific, Radical accused his publisher Digerati of overstating the localization and translation fees Digerati paid to another company in order to reduce the revenue share paid to Radical. This demonstrates some of the complications that may arise from such a clause. However, this legal dispute did not involve Critivo, and therefore it will be analyzed later in this video. For now, let's return to Critivo's contract.
Royalties earned hereunder will be accrued quarterly and paid in United States dollars, less all advances and other permitted charges.
This lets the publisher reduce the royalties paid to the developer by the so-called advance costs, which the publisher chose.
Neither party makes any guarantee of success with respect to revenue to be achieved or royalties to be earned from the product.
This would let the publisher hypothetically whittle the royalty down to zero by commissioning extremely expensive translations to a localization company that may or may not be owned by the publisher. Remember,
Critivo shall choose the manner, method, and cost of each localization.
And that's not the worst of it.
If the agreement is terminated by Critivo under Section 13b(1) and 13b(4) above, developer hereby irrevocably assigns all intellectual property rights in and to the product, including any source code and other materials related to the product, to Critivo.
How does this correspond with what the publisher's website says?
We don't steal souls, and we certainly won't steal your intellectual property. Your IP remains yours. We partner with you on your project for a predetermined amount of time. You receive all of the benefits we offer until that time runs out. We give you the tools you need to succeed, and you retain complete creative freedom and control over your IP. That's just how we roll. Your IP remains yours.
Remember, contracts are legally enforced. Vague promises on the website are not. Apparently, the website's promises about developers retaining intellectual property does not apply if the agreement is terminated by Critivo under Section 13b(1) and 13b(4). Section 13b(1) may refer to this clause.
In the event of a material breach of this agreement by developer, Critivo shall have the right to suspend Critivo's obligations to make payments to developer and offset any royalties or other payments due to developer under this agreement against any sums owed by developer to Critivo under this agreement until developer has cured such breach. If such breach is not cured within the cure period, Critivo shall have the right to terminate this agreement.
Section 13b(4) may refer to this paragraph.
Delivery. In the event that developer fails to deliver the product by the Goldmaster delivery date, Critivo may make other arrangements, including but not limited to engaging third-party consultants to develop the product. All costs associated therewith shall be fully recoupable at any time from any and all royalties and other sums accruing to developer under this agreement. Upon notice by Critivo of its intention to develop the product in the manner aforesaid, developer shall deliver to Critivo all materials reasonably requested or required by Critivo to do so, including but not limited to the source code and the development tools to be used solely in connection with exploiting the product, subject to Critivo's continuing obligation to account for royalties.
This section does not talk about termination and even suggests the publisher has a continuing obligation to account for royalties. Of course, an earlier section has absolved the publisher from any guarantee of success with respect to revenue to be achieved or royalties to be earned from the product. The aforementioned section has given the publisher the right to subtract the cost of additional translation from the royalties to be paid to the developer.
All costs associated therewith shall be fully recoupable at any time from any and all royalties and other sums accruing to developer under this agreement.
Who determines the cost again?
Critivo shall have the right to request additional translations or localization of the product by providing notice to developer. Critivo shall choose the manner, method, and cost of each localization.
The contract lets the publisher recoup its chosen cost from the royalties should a developer fail to deliver the product by the Goldmaster delivery date. This delivery section would also force the developer to deliver the source code and development tools to the publisher, who could then make other arrangements including hiring someone else to develop the product. However, Critivo's options are not limited to commissioning external development, as Critivo is also a developer and has crowdfunded a game they built themselves. It looks like Critivo could easily take over development of the contracted product if they wanted to. This delivery section also lets the publisher deduct the cost of this development from the royalties owed to the developer who signs this contract. Apparently, the publisher may also somehow use this section to terminate the contract and seize all intellectual property rights to the product and its source code. Why would any developer sign this? What does the publisher say it will provide to entice gullible developers? Publishers are supposed to fund the development of the game and handle its marketing. What responsibilities does this contract impose on the publisher?
Critivo shall determine the manner and method of publishing, maintaining, marketing, and distributing the product and ancillary products, including, without limitation, marketing plans, expenditures, advertising and promotion, packaging, channels of distribution, press releases, influencer lists, distribution of the product to Critivo Platinum members, and the price and release date of the product and ancillary products.
That doesn't sound much like responsibilities and more like rights. The publisher shall determine the manner and method of publishing, as well as the price and release date.
Publisher shall use commercially reasonable efforts to support developers' development for the product.
Of course, the document does not define commercially reasonable. In the absence of a stipulated definition, who gets to determine what is commercially reasonable? Who has the power to interpret this contract and its enforcement? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below.
Publisher shall provide a professionally crafted website for the product, along with related branding, in accordance with developer specifications which have been mutually agreed upon between the parties.
Finally, something tangible.
Publisher shall develop a launcher patcher for the product that will streamline the deployment process for new content and offer product users a way to keep their product updated.
This is a commitment, though it may not yield a desirable result. PC players have often had to put up with launchers that fail to properly patch their game, if they manage to download it in the first place.
Publisher shall use commercially reasonable efforts to promote and market the product.
Again, There's that weasel word, commercially reasonable. This word is so common in this contract you'd think it would be defined in the section dedicated to definitions. But nope.
Publisher shall use commercially reasonable efforts to run e-blast promotional events in order to increase coverage of the product.
Here's another clause that features commercially reasonable. Not surprisingly, the obligations imposed on the developer are not nearly as ambiguous.
If developer possesses any collections or lists of user email addresses in connection with the product on the effective date, then developer shall promptly provide such user email information to publisher, and any subsequent user email signups occurring after developer provides such information shall be managed exclusively by publisher.
Does this comply with data protection laws like the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation? Contrast that with the publisher's next obligation.
Publisher shall use commercially reasonable efforts to establish connections with new content creators.
Hey, it's our old friend, commercially reasonable.
Convention showcasing. Publisher shall showcase the product in at least 2 major video game conventions like Gamescom, PAX, E3, etc.
Finally, we get to another tangible commitment. This is possibly the only indisputable benefit developers get by signing this contract, as from what we've heard, this publisher didn't offer much, if anything, in the way of funding. The source said Critivo were unwilling to go past $10,000, saying it was unusual for them to provide any money. This $10,000 figure has not yet been confirmed by any independent source, though Critivo's website may hold clues that help gauge its plausibility. We'll give you the initial financial push you need to work in peace, if you need the kind of budget that only crowdfunding can provide. If Critivo cannot provide the budget the developer needs, what's the point of signing with them? If the developer would ultimately have to resort to crowdfunding anyway, why would they even subject themselves to these terms?
Royalties for net revenue derived throughout the territory from the commercial exploitation of the product and ancillary products shall be paid at the following rates. For sales of the product from Steam, publisher shall pay to developer a royalty of 63%. For sales of the product from consoles, publisher shall pay to developer a royalty of 63%. For sales of the product on the Critivo store, publisher shall pay to developer a royalty of 63%, after deducting the 15% Critivo store fee as part of the net revenue calculation. For sales of the product from any other platforms, publisher shall pay to developer a royalty of 63%.
Why would any developer give up 37% of the revenue from the sales of their game and possibly their intellectual property in exchange for what? A website? A launcher? Promotion at 2 game conventions? Whatever it is Critivo provides, it apparently does not amount to much financially, as one of the games Critivo uses as an example of its crowdfunding success is a project that asked for $4,800. You cannot provide $4,800 and you have the nerve to call yourself a publisher?
You will be glad to have a publisher who knows a thing or two about blasting through funding goals.
They're not kidding. One of the games presented in Critivo's crowdfunding section is the Universe Sim, a title Critivo developed in-house. It is interesting to observe Critivo promising the game will have no microtransactions or paid DLCs in the Kickstarter page, only to add them later, once the game was funded, developed and published in early access. Although at these prices it might be more accurate to call them macrotransactions. If they're selling in-game items at $250, why the hell can't they afford to provide the funding their developers need? Why do they need to direct their developers to Kickstarter? Why are they bragging about their own crowdfunding campaign when they purport to be a publisher? What good is a publisher that can't fund its own game? Why would anyone sign a contract with them? Why would anyone agree to such terms? The comment left in response to the first video may have the answer.
The clauses themselves, they are mostly industry standard. You would have a very hard time finding a publisher with more favorable clauses. The contract shown is very much standard.
Is that accurate? Let's compare Critivo's contract with the contract that was disclosed as a publicity stunt by its own publisher, Raw Fury.
Developer hereby grants to publisher an exclusive right during the term and throughout the territory to publish, produce, reproduce, perform, promote, advertise, export, import, rent, license, sub-license, translate, localize, manufacture, package, market, merchandise, distribute through any channels, including electronic distribution by download, display, sell, lease, and otherwise exploit the game, including any ancillary products on the platform.
This is how the contract defines platform.
Developer shall deliver the game for PC, Windows. Publisher shall have rights for mobile, iOS, Android, PC, Mac, Linux, Steam OS, Microsoft platforms, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, and Windows 10 Store, Switch, and Sony PlayStation 4 and 5. Any successor platform to those listed above released within 10 years following the release date, publisher may request, in cooperation with the developer, who shall not unreasonably deny such a request, third-party porting and/or development of game where the cost of such work shall be deducted from gross revenue. For the sake of clarification, any such port shall be considered a game for purpose of this agreement.
And this is the term the contract refers to.
This agreement shall become effective from the effective date and shall be in full effect perpetually or until such time that it is terminated by one or both parties in accordance with articles of this agreement. Publisher shall be the exclusive publisher of the game and be responsible for the distribution of the game in the territory.
This is what the contract means when it says territory.
Publisher shall have the exclusive right to publish, distribute, and market the game and the ancillary products worldwide without any limitations.
So far, so good, but not for long.
Publisher is not obligated to make or continue to make the game commercially available.
What the hell is this? This alone would let Raw Fury keep the game off the market forever. It's made even worse by the next sentence.
Publisher has the exclusive right to market the game and developer entrusts and grants to publisher the right to determine, in its sole discretion, the manner and method of marketing and distribution of the game.
Thankfully, the contract has this clause.
Publisher shall, unless agreed in writing between developer and publisher, use commercially reasonable efforts to ensure the game will be released within 3 months of delivery of Goldmaster to publisher by developer.
Not so keen on commercially reasonable, but there are worse clauses in this contract, such as this one.
During the term, publisher shall have a right of first offer for the exclusive worldwide publishing rights to sequel.
Why should the publisher get first dibs on sequels? They are completely separate products.
During the term, developer may at any time request in writing to replace publisher's right of first offer, as stated above in the preceding paragraph, with a fixed and perpetual revenue share of 5% of gross revenues received by developer, which publisher is then entitled to, including but not limited to royalty payments, licensing fees, advances, or other financial transactions generated by any sequels.
This is awful. The developer would forever have to keep paying Raw Fury 5% of revenue from sequels if they chose to sign with another publisher. Even Critivo's contract did not have such a clause.
Publisher shall have no obligation to pay the additional advances and may, 60 days after delivering a written notice to developer, suspend or terminate the additional advances.
This is what the contract means when it says additional advances.
A monthly payment paid out before the 5th working day of every month for a period of designated months starting on designated date, totaling a designated number in dollars. Upon terminating the additional advances, publisher effectively terminates this agreement.
This section gives Raw Fury the right to cancel the contract by terminating additional advances, but specifies no consequence for cancelling the contract.
Publisher shall deduct the total principal amount from gross revenue until 100% plus markup, service spend, and marketing guarantee have been recovered, at which point developer share shall be considered fully repaid. For clarity, no revenue is shared with developer until total principal amount plus markup, service spend, and marketing guarantee have been fully repaid.
This is what the contract means by markup.
15% markup to publisher, calculated on total principal amount. No revenue is shared with developer until total principal amount plus markup has been fully repaid.
The developer gets nothing until the publisher recoups 115% of their expenses. That does not sound very reasonable, and the following paragraph does not make it any better.
If this agreement is terminated in accordance with the above section 11 before the total principal amount plus markup, service spend, and marketing guarantee have been repaid to publisher and developer licenses, sells, distributes, or in any other way exploits the game, then developer shall pay to publisher 70% of the gross revenue received by developer from the licensing, sale, distribution, or other exploitation of the game. and 50% of the gross revenue received by developer from the licensing, sale, distribution, or other exploitation of any work based upon or derived from the game, such as, but not limited to sequels, prequels, or ancillary products, derivative works, until the total amount paid by developer to publisher equals the total principal amount plus markup, service spend, and marketing guarantee.
It gets worse.
No revenue is shared with developer until service spend has been fully recovered by publisher.
What is service spend, you ask?
A maximum amount to be spent by publisher on additional services for the game up to its release date, including but not limited to QA, localization, voiceover, age rating, platform verification, platform developer kits, porting the game, team travel to events, fan events, and PR. If publisher believes an increase is needed to service spend, it shall inform developer in writing and request an adjustment. Developer shall not unreasonably deny such a request if it is suggested in good faith by publisher with the purpose to increase potential revenue and exposure of game and allow publisher to fully perform publisher's duties as set forward in this agreement.
The developer must let Raw Fury determine the amount they want to recoup before they start sharing any revenue with the developer. Does it get better for the developer after Raw Fury get what they want?
Publisher is entitled to publisher share of net revenue.
This is what the contract means by publisher share.
50% to publisher of net revenues.
Net revenue is gross revenue after deductions of every expense you can think of. The developer gets half of this. What do they have to do to get this half?
On the final delivery date, developer shall deliver a fully functional gold master for the game in executable object code form on the platforms in electronic format, bug-free, as hereinafter defined, and from which publisher can create copies of the game. Bug means any deviation from the commonly accepted standards for normal operation of games or any material error including, without limitation, an abnormal cessation of functioning of the game, but shall expressly not include deviations from that commonly accepted standards for normal operation of games that are not considered serious enough to block production or play.
That definition of bug sounds more reasonable than the clause in Critivo's contract.
In the event developer fails to deliver the gold master for the game by final delivery date, unless such delivery date has been extended by mutual agreement by the parties in accordance with the aforementioned procedure, developer shall be deemed to be in material breach of this agreement.
This sounds reasonable on the face of it.
If publisher terminates this agreement pursuant to this Section 15 and Section 22 of this agreement, all amounts paid by publisher in connection with the game shall be fully refundable, including any amount spent by publisher in accordance with Section 12 developer funding repayment and Section 13 service spend, along with any other incurred costs that publisher can reasonably maintain and prove to be associated with development of game.
Do you think the kind of developer that signs with Raw Fury can afford to reimburse their expenses?
Developer shall not make any claims of future development of game without consulting with publisher first, as further development support from publisher is not guaranteed.
The contract absolves the publisher of responsibility for supporting further development while granting them several exclusive rights to the product in perpetuity.
Publisher shall have the right to establish reserves for returns and defective games in accordance with publisher's business practices not to exceed 10% of royalties owed to developer.
Does this mean Raw Fury is keeping 10% from the developer's share? That does not sound fair. Speaking of unfair, just look at these clauses.
In the event of a material breach of this agreement by developer, publisher shall have the right to suspend publisher's obligations to make payments to developer and/or offset any developer share or other payments due to developer under this agreement against any sums owed by developer to publisher until developer has remedied such breach. If such breach is not remedied within 30 days of written notice, the remedy period, publisher shall have the right to immediately terminate this agreement. Upon termination pursuant to this Section 22b, publisher may, in its sole discretion, either demand developer's repayment of the initial advance and any additional advances, as well as other funding, which developer shall repay without delay in order for developer to maintain its rights to the game, and following such repayment, developer may repurchase the publishing, marketing, and distribution rights granted to publisher under this agreement at fair market value, as determined by the parties or a mutually agreed third-party valuator.
Could the kind of developer that signs with Raw Fury even afford it?
Or 2. all rights to the game shall immediately be assigned and transferred, free of charge, to publisher, in which case developer shall not be entitled to any developer share.
There it is, because no publishing contract would be complete without a clause that gives all rights to the publisher for free.
In such event, publisher shall be entitled to finalize the development work and release the game itself, or in collaboration with a third party chosen by publisher, if and when under Item 2, the gross revenues equals the total principal amount plus markup, service spend, and marketing guarantee. Publisher will set off and release developer from its claims for compensation against developer for such amounts. Nothing contained herein shall in any way limit publisher's other rights and remedies under this agreement at law or equity.
What consequences does Raw Fury face if they breach the contract?
In the event of termination by developer, all of publisher's rights to publish, market, and distribute the game shall cease, and all such rights granted to publisher shall revert back to developer. However, publisher shall be entitled to an amount corresponding to 50% of the gross revenues until the total principal amount, service spend, and marketing guarantee are repaid in full.
When Raw Fury breaches a contract, they get paid. When Raw Fury terminates the contract due to material breach by the developer, Raw Fury gets paid. The publisher gets paid no matter what. That sure sounds fair. Their developers must love it, at least publicly, for they sure can't say that they don't like it.
Non-disparagement. The parties acknowledge and agree not to make any statements, written or verbal, or cause or encourage others to make any statements, written or verbal, that defame, disparage, or in any way criticize the personal or business reputation, practices, products, or conduct of the other party, its employees, associates, or partners. The parties acknowledge and agree that this prohibition extends to statements, written or verbal, made to anyone including but not limited to the news media, on forums, blogs, or any social network.
Wonder why Raw Fury felt the need for this paragraph. Raw Fury must have thought it seemed fair, for they disclosed it as a publicity stunt, and in so doing inspired another publisher to do the same, Thorn, who called themselves the company in their publishing agreement, which refers to their developer as the client.
The client hereby agrees to engage the company to provide the client with the following publishing services. The services: provide game publishing services, including, but not limited to, project management services if required by client, co-development and deployment services, porting services, office space and utilities as needed, use of equipment, professional consulting as requested or needed, usability and QA services and consultation, marketing services, major console deployment and deal negotiation, trade show assistance, localization services, international distribution, ratings, board certifications, digital, graphic, and asset design services, and management and business development services. The company will also provide, at the request of client and at no cost to the client, porting services to certain or all current generation consoles and platforms on which the project is intended to be sold as game performance dictates and as appropriate or relevant. As appropriate, the company will also provide, at the request of client and at no cost to the client, porting services to all 2 next-generation consoles, Microsoft, Sony, mobile devices, iOS, Android, and other consoles or streaming services. Unless otherwise specified, all services provided are a la carte, and each client will require different services. All services are provided at the company's expense, and unless otherwise specified in an amendment to this agreement, such expense is not subject to recuperation as detailed later in this agreement. Client shall have a right of approval over all ports of the project, including without limitation the creative elements. Client remains the sole developer of the project and must continue development toward a reasonable Goldmaster candidate for PC in good faith. Following the initial commercial launch of the project, the company and the client shall discuss in good faith the plan for any updates and/or DLC for the project, and the client shall have a right of first refusal to develop any such updates and/or DLC on terms to be agreed in good faith, provided that the compensation offered to the client by the company shall be calculated on a basis that is no less favorable than the calculation of the development funding. The company, in consideration of the offer of the services extended in this agreement, is entitled to a specified percentage of net revenue, as defined below, of the project until such time as 100% of the development funding and 30% of the marketing outlay has been recuperated, and thereafter. A designated percentage of net revenue, as defined below, of the project for a term of 24 calendar months after the launch date, the income term, defined as the date the project first becomes available for sale to the general public on a marketplace.
While this document does not specify the percentages, Whitethorn's website is more transparent with their numbers.
Average percent of net revenue due to Whitethorn per title, 28%. Average amount of direct funding per title, $232,100. Average direct marketing spend per title, $56,000. The income term will renew indefinitely, yearly, through issuance of a renewal agreement to be signed by the client after the 24th month of the project's public availability. In the event that either client or company does not wish to execute the renewal agreement, all publishing services will terminate and all companies' rights in and to the project will automatically and immediately revert to the client. In the event of any such reversion, it is the client's responsibility to work with platform holders to become a licensed distributor of content, and the company will make reasonable accommodations and provide reasonable assistance to facilitate this process.
That sounds very reasonable.
All intellectual property and related material, rights and assets that are developed or produced under this agreement or otherwise, with respect to the project, including, without limitation, any DLC, updates and ports of the project. The intellectual property from inception is and shall remain the sole property of the client, including, without limitation, the worldwide copyright therein, and extensions and renewals of copyright, trademarks, service marks, and all creative elements and ideas. The company reserves the right to use the likeness of the intellectual property in promotional and advertising materials solely relating to the promotion of the project during the term, but otherwise claims no ownership of the intellectual property.
Whitethorn's agreement sounds like the most reasonable contract in this video, though there is one more contract you need to see, and this might be the most important document featured in this video, as it was not leaked or disclosed as a publicity stunt. This agreement was exposed as the basis of an active lawsuit between a developer who crowdfunded over 25,000 Swiss francs to kickstart his game, and the publisher he chose to sign with. Both the developer and the publisher made videos explaining their perspective and detailing how they felt they had been wronged by each other. The purpose of this video is not to recite every accusation made by both parties, but rather to explore the contract, as this is the part consumers don't usually get to see. What makes this document particularly interesting is the fact that it is a finalized contract that specifies in detail the amounts paid to the developer, which in this case constitute a monthly payment of $5,500 for a period of 12 months, amounting to $66,000 in total. This explains why a crowd-funded developer might sign with a publisher. They want more money than they raised, though this developer does not seem to be satisfied with the outcome.
The publisher hasn't paid us our game's revenues.
The developer claimed to not have been paid in full in their legal complaint, which alleges that the publisher still owes the developer an amount of $5,500. Additionally, the developer also said that it has not received the full amount of the adjusted gross revenue. What is that, you ask?
Adjusted gross revenue means gross revenues actually received by publisher from the exploitation of the licensed game less any and all selling expenses. For the avoidance of doubt, revenue derived from downloadable content developed for the licensed game shall be considered gross revenues from the exploitation of the licensed game. During the recouping period, publisher will pay the developer 20% of the adjusted gross revenue, and publisher will retain 80% of the adjusted gross revenue.
That's not the worst sharing arrangement seen so far. 20% is better than nothing.
After the recouping period, once all recoupable payments have been recouped, publisher will pay the developer 50% of the adjusted gross revenue, and publisher will retain 50% of the adjusted gross revenue.
That's not the most generous split for a post-recouping period share, and to make matters worse, the developer claims to not have been paid at all.
To be blunt, Conradical has not received a single dollar in royalties from the publisher based on sales of the game.
The developer estimates the unpaid amount to be of about $15,000. The developer also claimed the publisher had not disclosed the money it had allegedly received from other companies for the game. What did the developer have to do to get paid?
Developer shall deliver the licensed game in executable format for all delivery platforms, free of all defects, to publisher, in a form and format specified by publisher unless otherwise agreed upon by the parties in writing. the developer has no obligation to prepare the licensed game in executable format for platforms other than delivery platforms at any time or at all. Developer shall, however, upon publisher's commercially reasonable request, provide such variants or versions of the licensed game for the delivery platforms as may be necessary to port the licensed game to the publication platforms. Additionally, developer shall promptly deliver any and all bug fixes, updates, or upgrades of the licensed game that developer develops for the delivery platforms and other platforms, if any. Developer shall, at any time prior to the delivery in Section 4b above, and at publisher's request, deliver or otherwise make available the then current build of the licensed game for the delivery platforms specified by publisher in both object code and source code formats, and in accordance with any quality or performance milestones communicated to developer by publisher no later than 30 days from the date of each such request.
These clauses sound familiar, though this next one does not.
Publisher may terminate this agreement with 30 days written notice if there is a change of control, whether directly or indirectly, de jure or de facto, of developer.
This clause is unilateral and does not give the developer the same right if the same circumstance were to befall the publisher. Nevertheless, this developer tried to invoke it as one of his reasons in his attempt to terminate the contract in his favor.
The tragic and unexpected passing of the founder and CEO of the publisher has resulted in a severe change of circumstances affecting the contract. One of the main reasons by which the developer decided to work with the publisher in connection with the distribution of the licensed game was the developer's trust in his experience and skill in this industry, and his unfortunate demise has had a noticeable impact in the publisher's situation and their ability to properly distribute the licensed game and otherwise perform its obligations under the contract.
It'll be interesting to see if this holds up in court. The publisher, for its part, argued that nothing in the licensing agreement allows the developer to terminate the licensing agreement if the CEO no longer works at the publisher, or if there is a change of control, whether directly or indirectly de jure or de facto, of the publisher. The complaint did not just dispute payment and control, it also raised issues that affected consumers. To be specific,
the publisher has not properly tested and ported the licensed game for its Switch and PlayStation ports, and as a result, the versions of the licensed game for such platforms present numerous bugs, rendering portions, at least, of the licensed game unplayable. During this process, the publisher has not honored requests from the developer to improve and fix these issues, and to delay the launch of the licensed game in such platforms. Launching severely flawed versions of the licensed game constitutes a negligent performance of the publisher's obligations under the contract, including Section 3A, since selling knowingly an unusable product constitutes a breach of false advertising and other customer protection laws, and does not meet the developer's commercially reasonable quality standard.
The developer didn't just complain about quality control in this lawsuit. He also announced on Twitter that he disapproved of the versions that were launched and warned of bugs that were confirmed by users playing the game. The publisher did not like these tweets and demanded this retraction from the developer.
1. After some research, I've realized that the released version is in fact the one that I tested previously, and I was aware of the version of the game which was to be launched. 2. Any comments I have made following the release should not be interpreted as me having been let down by Digerati Distribution, who have been nothing but fully supportive throughout the development of the game and have helped me to successfully release my first game. Both Digerati and I are disappointed that the intended Day 1 patch for the game has not yet been made available.
The publisher also demanded that the developer delete the statements for being defamatory and containing confidential information. If the developer did not comply, the publisher would delay or reduce payment owed to the developer. The developer then denied that his statements were libel, citing truth as an absolute defense to claims of defamation. The developer pointed to a screenshot of the publisher acknowledging performance issues in the Switch version of the game. He then used this acknowledgement to argue that performance issues could not be confidential information. The developer then accused the publisher of failing to respond to accusations of other contractual breaches, including undisclosed revenue sources, payment defaults, and delays. The developer complained about the publisher selling the game at a discount almost immediately after launching it, which the developer pointed to as evidence of the publisher's disregard for the product. Consumers might not be upset by an early discount, but they could be affected by another situation described by the developer.
The publisher has failed to deliver keys of the licensed game to all of the backers of the Kickstarter campaign, breaching Section 4J of the agreement. The developer does not have the necessary access or permission to obtain and send those keys, and therefore cannot resolve this problem. which is creating a huge amount of frustration among the backers that is damaging the developer's brand.
Wonder how Kickstarter backers feel after crowdfunding the game only to see the developer sign with the publisher to get even more money, and then not get the product they paid for. The developer then proposed a settlement where the agreement would be terminated, control of the game and its distribution would be surrendered to the developer, along with a single payment of $60,000 in lieu of the amounts owed. The proposed settlement would also demand that the publisher refrain from publicly or privately, directly or indirectly, making any type of statement, communication or announcement that contradicts, refutes, disparages or otherwise may violate the developer's rights and status with respect to the licensed game, or that may affect the developer's brand. If all of the above conditions have been met in manner satisfactory to the developer and the publisher shall agree on a statement indicating that the developer and the publisher have decided to terminate the agreement, without assigning fault or blame, or otherwise providing any other details as to the settlement, and that the developer is, from that moment on, in charge of the licensed game's distribution. Do you think that was the end of the dispute? Of course not. The publisher amended his complaint to accuse other studios of encouraging the developer to breach the contract, citing similarities with disputes the publisher had with these studios. The publisher also included screenshots that used to argue that the developer was aware the game would be available on consoles. The publisher also provided screenshots of the developer acknowledging involvement in porting and localization, as well as screenshots of the developer informing consumers that the game was available to purchase at discounts of 20% and 25%. Here is the most interesting part. The publisher provided screenshots of the developer celebrating the launch of the game on PlayStation 4 and 5 on the 30th of November 2022 and announcing the game's release on Switch in the same tweet. One day earlier, on the 29th of November 2022 to be specific, the developer had sent the publisher a legal notice demanding that the publisher stop the planned launches of the game on Switch and PlayStation, accusing those versions of presenting numerous bugs, rendering at least portions of the game unplayable. The very next day, the very same developer was publicly celebrating the launch of the versions he had legally accused of being borderline unplayable. Can anyone explain this? Why would you celebrate the release of something you have already accused of being unacceptably flawed? The day after that, December 1st, 2022 to be specific, the developer publicly retracted his enthusiasm and announced his disapproval of the launched versions that he had celebrated 24 hours earlier, despite the fact that he had already been embroiled in a legal dispute to stop the distribution of those versions for at least 48 hours. The developer defended his celebration by claiming he was told that the PlayStation versions would be up to date. The developer said he thought the PlayStation version would release without many of the bugs that ended up in this version, because he was told with Sony we'd be able to self-approve any patch. The developer was told this on the 15th of November. 14 days later, on the 29th of November 2022, the developer's attorney sent that notice demanding that the publisher stop selling the game on consoles, accusing those versions of being riddled with bugs to the point of being borderline unplayable. The developer's explanation of his celebratory tweet does not address the status of that legal dispute at the time he publicly celebrated the launch of the console versions. Did anything happen on the 30th of November that convinced the developer that the console launches were not something to legally dispute, but instead something to publicly celebrate? His explanation does not mention any event that occurred on the 30th of November that convinced him to change his mind on that day alone. His abrupt reversals in the 48 hours between November 29th and December 1st remain inexplicable, at least in the documents that could be obtained in preparation for this video. It may be possible that the developer has addressed his celebratory tweets in a document that could not be obtained for this video. Though if there was ever a time and place to explain his motivation and mindset behind that tweet, it would be this, the section he dedicated to defending his tweets. Did the developer just forget on November 30th that he had just engaged in legal action to stop the release of the ports he was now celebrating? In the absence of an explanation, it might look like the developer promoted a product he knew to be defective, and that might not be a good look from a consumer's perspective. The developer was contacted in preparation for this video, but he did not reply, though his reluctance to respond is understandable due to the ongoing legal dispute. The developer had an easier time defending his transparency with users regarding the bugs affecting the game, refuting the publisher's characterization of his tweets as false statements by pointing to users complaining about their experience with the problems he warned of. The publisher's characterization of the developer's warning to users as needless may not be a good look from the consumer's perspective. It would seem from the publisher's complaint that the problem the publisher has with the developer's statement is that it's hurting sales, with no concern expressed for the impact on consumers. The publisher also calls the developer's statement false without addressing confirmation from consumers who have experienced problems playing the game. The publisher also claims this statement falsely implies the publisher is not proactively attempting to resolve the bugs, but all that can be seen in this exact tweet is the developer acknowledging certain problems that could affect user experience and warning consumers. This tweet does not seem to mention the publisher or their activity, so it is difficult to ascertain what part of it the publisher finds to be false. This is not the only inconsistency disputed between the publisher and developer. The publisher does address the problems afflicting the game by accusing the developer of failing to deliver the game free of all defects and failing to provide variants and bug fixes, updates and upgrades necessary for the game on all delivery platforms, including Steam, Switch and PlayStation. The agreement obtained for this video does not seem to list Switch and PlayStation as delivery platforms.
Delivery platforms means Microsoft Windows.
The agreement does mention PlayStation and Switch, but just as a sample for reporting data. This is what the agreement says about platforms other than the delivery platforms.
The developer has no obligation to prepare the licensed game in executable format for platforms other than delivery platforms at any time or at all. Developer shall, however, upon publisher's commercially reasonable request, provide such variants or versions of the licensed game for the delivery platforms as may be necessary to port the licensed game to the publication platforms.
It is unclear if or when PlayStation and Switch were added to the delivery platforms that the developer became responsible for, as no such amendment was found in the documents obtained for this video. It is possible that these inconsistencies have been clarified in the documents that could not be obtained for this video, of which there are several. This channel may analyze these documents if and when they become publicly available, so please subscribe and set the bell to all notifications so you won't miss out. That concludes this analysis of publishing contracts. If you found this video interesting, please like it and share it to spread the word.